This is the Music Halls of Fame podcast. This week we honor the year in music for 1986 along with a member of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame class of 1986. We also make the case for putting producer Rick Rubin into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Plus, our Spotlight Hall of Fame is the United States Library of Congress National Recording Registry in Washington, D.C. Before we get going with the podcast, like everyone tells you, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you'll know when these podcast episodes drop, which is usually every Thursday. Now, on to this week's episode. The year was 1986. In music for the year of 1986, The Phantom of the Opera musical premiered in London, England. It finally hit Broadway in 1988. The Monkees went on a reunion tour after gaining renewed popularity from MTV running their original television show from the 1960s. Bob Geldof was given knighthood by Queen Elizabeth II for his efforts to end hunger in Africa. The group Queen, meanwhile, played their final concert with Freddie Mercury at the helm. The Smiths called it quits just as they were beginning to hit the mainstream. Also calling it quits in 1986, Wham! Black Flag, ELO, otherwise known as Electric Light Orchestra, Men at Work, Arcadia, Asia, Boney M., the Boomtown Rats, Thin Lizzy, Matumi, Utopia, The Clash, Con-Funk Shun, Culture Club, Weather Report, The Dead Kennedys, Emerson, Lake and Powell, A Flock of Seagulls, Pablo Cruz, The Police, and Prince and the Revolution. At least one-third of those bands got back together to do those nostalgia tours that are popular these days. Who got together in 1986? The Afghan Wigs, Beatmasters, Big Head Todd and the Monsters, Climby Fisher, No Doubt, Company B, Cowboy Junkies, the David Lee Roth Band with guitarist Steve Vai, Eric B. and Rakim, Faster Pussycat, Frontline Assembly, the Ghetto Boys, the Goo Goo Dolls, Jesus Jones, Johnny Hates Jazz, King Missile, the Lemonheads, Leaders of the New School, Manic Street Preachers, M.O.D., 24/7 Spies, Morbid, NWA, Naughty by Nature, Nelson, The Pixies, Prong, Roxette, Toad the Wet Sprocket, Timbuk 3, T'Pow, Transvision Vamp, The Veldt, Sweethearts of the Rodeo, The Sugar Cube, Skid Row, Stabbing Westward, and Texas. Also, the music magazine Q launched in 1986. Hip-hop broke into the mainstream with hit albums like Run DMC's Raising Hell and the Beastie Boys' License to Ill. Other important albums were released by Africa Bambaataa and Soul Sonic Force, Salt and Peppa, Stetsasonic, Kool Moe Dee, Houdini, UTFO, The Fat Boys, and Grandmaster Flash. Alternative music, also known as college radio back in the day, began to show up on mainstream radio stations with artists like R.E.M. and INXS getting modestly popular before becoming superstars in the early 1990s. In 1986, for the first time on the Billboard magazine Country Music Singles Chart, no song held the number one slot for longer than 1 week. When all was said and done, though, a song that made the country charts, even though it was really a pop song, was the biggest country song of the year. Billy Vera and the Beatles' song At This Moment became a huge country pop crossover hit due to an episode of the Michael J. Fox TV series Family Ties that used the song in one episode. Other big country songs were Roseanne Cash's Never Be You, Kenny Rogers' Morning Desire, and also Tomb of the Unknown Love, Lionel Richie's Deep River Woman, Reba McEntire's Whoever's in New England, Steve Warner's You Can Dream of Me, Hank Williams Jr.'s Mind Your Own Business, the Forster Sisters' Just in Case, and Randy Travis's On the Other Hand. Dance music was still the domain of pop and R&B artists doing remixes. However, in the clubs, house and trance music filled the speakers, with both being considered music of Black, Latino, and gay people, and thus considered underground music at the time. Still, there were club hits like Grace Jones's iconic Slave to the Rhythm, Colonel Abrams' I'm Not Gonna Let, and DeHar's Braxton's Jump Back Set You Free that joined songs by Janet Jackson, Bananarama, The Human League, and Peter Gabriel in getting to the #1 club play spot on Billboard's club play charts. There were also acts that piggybacked on Like a Virgin Madonna era's sound because, of course, imitation is the sincerest form of a lack of imagination, although it will bring you popularity of your own sometimes. Case in point, Regina's Baby Love and Alicia's Baby Talk both hit #1 on the club play chart by essentially cutting and pasting Madonna's style. It's what record labels do with every hot genre. See boy bands, hair bands, grunge, EDM, etc., etc. According to Billboard magazine, That's What Friends Are For by Dionne Warwick and Friends was the biggest single of the year. The others were Say You, Say Me by Lionel Richie, I Miss You by Climax, On My Own by Patti LaBelle and Michael McDonald, Mr. Mister's Broken Wings, Whitney Houston's How Will I Know, Party All the Time by Eddie Murphy, Survivor's Burning Heart, Mr. Mister's Kyrie, Falco's Rock Me Amadeus, Madonna's Papa Don't Preach, Berlin's Take My Breath Away, Pet Shop Boys, West End Girls, Mike and the Mechanics' All I Need Is a Miracle, Kenny Loggins' Danger Zone, Lionel Richie's Dancing on the Ceiling, Force MD's Tender Love, and Robert Palmer's Addicted to Love. Whitney Houston's debut self-titled album was the biggest album of the year. It was also the year of Heart's self-titled album, ZZ Top's Afterburner, Dire Straits' Brothers in Arms, Janet Jackson's Control, Mr. Mister's Welcome to the Real World, Sade's Promise, Phil Collins' No Jacket Required, and Gloria Estefan and Miami Sound Machine's Primitive Love. It was also the year of the Top Gun soundtrack with big hits by Kenny Loggins and Berlin, Madonna's True Blue album, Peter Gabriel's hit album So, the return of Van Halen with Sammy Hagar as the new frontman, Bon Jovi's Slippery When Wet, which helped to usher in the hair band era, and Steve Winwood had his comeback album that year with Back in the High Life. DJ Snake, DJ Alice in Wonderland, Lady Gaga, Drake, Ellie Goulding, Solange Knowles, Florence Welch of Florence and the Machine, Kelly Pickler, Skylar Grey, John Baptiste, Charlotte Church, Alex Turner of Arctic Monkeys, Ollie Sykes of Bring Me the Horizon, Matt Heafy of Trivium, Mario, Hilary Scott of Lady Antebellum, now known as Lady A, Jimmy Allen, Ashley Monroe, the Pistol Annies, violinist Lindsey Sterling, bassist Tal Wilkenfeld, Kevin Parker, a.k.a. Tame Impala, David Jones of McFly, singers, actresses Cassie, Lea Michele, Leighton Meester, Lindsay Lohan, Emmy Rossum, Leaky Lee, and Stacey Orico, actress and DJ Ruby Rose, and rapper Kevin Gates, all were born in 1986. Music artists who passed away in 1986 include Cliff Burton of Metallica, who was killed when Metallica's tour bus was involved in an accident, Phil Lynott of Thin Lizzy, Richard Manuel of The Band, entertainers Desi Arnaz, Kate Smith, Dean Reed, Gordon McRae, and Scatman Crothers, manager Albert Grossman, disc jockeys John R. and William B. Williams, guitarist Robbie Basho, record exec Moses Ash of Ash Records, jazz trumpet player Thad Jones, singer Esquerita, saxophonist Eddie Lockjaw Davis, Tracy Pugh of The Saints, singer and blues guitarist Bea Boos, singer Lee Dorsey, Billy Rancher of Billy Rancher and the Unreal Gods, Hollywood Fats of Canned Heat, Tommy Kiefer of Crocus, John Farrell of Return to Forever, harpist Dorothy Ashby, jazz saxophonist Hank Mobley, guitarist Clarence Garlow, folk singer Kate Wolf, the king of swing himself, band leader Benny Goodman, blues harmonica player Sonny Terry, O'Kelly Isley Jr. of the Isley Brothers, country music guitarist Joe Maphis, Bobby Nunn of the Coasters, and singer Mark Dinning all passed away in 1986. At the Grammy Awards for Music of 1986, Graceland from Paul Simon won Album of the Year. That's What Friends Are For from Dionne Warwick, Sir Elton John, Gladys Knight, and Stevie Wonder won Song of the Year. Steve Winwood won Record of the Year for Higher Love with Chaka Khan, and Bruce Hornsby and the Range won Best New Artist. At the MTV Video Music Awards, Dire Straits' Money for Nothing won Music Video of the Year. At the American Music Awards for the music of 1986, Whitney Houston, Lionel Richie, and Huey Lewis and the News were the big winners. Hank Williams Jr. won the Academy of Country Music Entertainer of the Year award. Luther Vandross, Janet Jackson, and Cameo were the big winners at the very first Soul Train Music Awards. The Billboard Music Awards didn't start until 1990. At the Eurovision Singing Contest that was held in Norway that year, Sandra Kim from Belgium won. At the Tony Awards, The Mystery of Edwin Drood won Best Musical, and Sweet Charity won Best Revival of a Musical. Musically, at the Academy Awards, Herbie Hancock won Best Original Film Score for Round Midnight, while Take My Breath Away from Top Gun won Best Original Song. The Pulitzer Prize in Music was awarded to George Pearl for Wind Quintet No. 4 for flute, oboe, clarinet, horn, and bassoon, and George Rochberg for Symphony No. 5. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction ceremony was held on January 23, 1986 at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York City. 1986 was the inaugural class of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, even though a physical museum wouldn't be opened until 1995 in Cleveland, Ohio. Talent scout and record producer John Henry Hammond II, father of famed blues musician John P. Hammond, was the first person inducted into the Non-Performer Lifetime Achievement Award category. Radio disc jockey Alan Freed, who held the first rock and roll concert in Cleveland, Ohio, and also coined the phrase rock and roll in the mainstream, as well as Sun Records owner Sam Phillips, were inducted into the non-performers category. Jimmy Rogers, Jimmy Yancey, and Robert Johnson were inducted into the early influencers category, and 10 members were inducted into the performers category for the Hall in its very first year. They were Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Sam Cooke, Fats Domino, the Everly Brothers, Buddy Holly, Jerry Lee Lewis, Elvis Presley, Ray Charles, and this next artist. James Brown was the godfather of soul, the hardest working man in showbiz, Kid Dynamite, and Soul Brother #1, and he earned every single one of those nicknames. The man practically invented the soul and funk genres with his high-energy songs and a stage presence that has been copied by everybody ever since. When you see Prince, Rick James, Michael Jackson, or anybody who those guys influenced, or practically anybody on stage dancing to the music these days, you're really looking at pale imitations of James. Early hip-hop, in fact, wouldn't even exist today without both George Clinton and James Brown. Rap and R&B artists have lifted samples from Papa's Got a Brand New Bag, Sex Machine, Keep It Funky, The Payback, I'm Black and I'm Proud, and countless other songs of James's. James Brown was born on May 3, 1933 in Barnwell, South Carolina. When he was a teenager, he was put into reform school due to some armed robberies that he had done. While he was there, he met and became friends with Bobby Byrd. After they got out of reform school, James went to live with Byrd's family. He started out as a gospel singer. Byrd started a gospel group called the Gospel Starlighters, which became the Avons. That group had Troy Collins, Doyle Oglesby, Sylvester Keels, and Willie Johnson. James eventually started his own group called the Ever Ready Gospel Singers and recruited Johnny Terry into his group after the two of them had become friends while also in reform school. Right around the time that James's group had broken up, Troy Collins from Bobby's group, the Avons, was killed in a car accident. Bobby asked James to join his group. Johnny Terry ended up joining them along with guitarist Nate Floyd Scott. Willie Johnson left the group and was replaced by Fred Pulliam. After the group saw Little Richard perform, they decided to leave gospel music and start doing R&B. They changed their name to the Flames and then the Famous Flames, with James eventually becoming their lead singer. They also switched out some more members, with some of those members forming another group called the Fabulous Flames. Their first hit was Please, 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 which went top 10 on the Billboard R&B chart. After that, the hits started rolling, from Try Me to Night Train to Papa's Got a Brand New Bag to I Got You, I Feel Good. Let's talk for a couple minutes about his most critically successful album and his most popular song. James Brown Live at the Apollo was made in 1962. At that point, James had the hit Night Train and wanted to build his reputation even more by putting out a live album. The powers that be at the record label King Records didn't like that idea at all. They thought that live albums didn't even sell. James paid for the concert himself, and on October 24, 1962, he and the Famous Flames recorded their performance. In May of 1963, King Records reluctantly released James Brown Live at the Apollo. The album became a huge hit, much to their surprise. The album went to number 2 on the charts and stayed on the charts for 14 months. It is listed as one of the greatest albums of all time by Rolling Stone magazine, and also the greatest live recording of all time. In 2004, it was even added to the Library of Congress's National Recording Registry, and in 1998, it was inducted into the Grammy Hall of Fame. On May 6, 1965, James recorded what became probably his best-known song. Officially called I Got You, but also known as I Feel Good, James originally wrote the song a few years earlier. At the time, it was called I Found You and was released in 1962 by Yvonne Fair, who was James's backup singer. James rewrote the lyrics and recorded it again in 1964, but with different instrumentation than the 1965 version. That version was going to be released as a single, but couldn't because of a contract dispute that James was having with his record label, King Records, at the time. The next year, in Criteria Studios in Miami, Florida, James recorded a different version. He released that version in October of that year. The song got to number 3 on Billboard's Hot 100 chart, becoming his highest charting single on that chart. Eventually, the Famous Flames did the usual music route of breaking up and filing lawsuits over royalties, but James persisted, marched on, and got a new group together called the JBs. Still, the group's place was secured into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame due to the group's string of big hits. However, when James Brown was inducted into the Hall in the inaugural class of 1986, the Famous Flames were not inducted with him. In 2012, the Hall fixed that, along with some other groups whose lead singers were inducted separately, and inducted his original Famous Flame members Bobby Bennett, Bobby Byrd, Lloyd Stallworth, and Johnny Terry, who made up the core of the group during their original heyday. Meanwhile, the group the JBs consisted of Bobby Byrd, whose role as James's wingman on stage was the prototype for every single hype man who ever existed on any stage anywhere at any time. The group also had bassist Bootsy Collins, who would go on to become the bassist for the iconic funk group fronted by the great George Clinton, Parliament Funkadelic. As far as James Brown and the JBs went, the hits kept rolling, while firmly establishing what became known as funk music. The group had hits like Get Up Off of That Thing, Papa Don't Take No Mess, Sex Machine, which was heavily sampled in songs like Vanessa Williams' The Right Stuff, and The Payback, which was also heavily sampled in songs like En Vogue's My Love, Never Gonna Get It. There were also songs about social consciousness like Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud. And while James was seen as a civil rights champion and was credited with keeping the city of Boston, Massachusetts from rioting during the aftermath of Dr. Martin Luther King's assassination in 1968, when he was performing a concert that night and decided to actually let the recording of the concert go on local television. James also supported Richard Nixon's 1972 re-election bid, a move that rubbed many of his fans the wrong way and actually cost him in record sales. Of course, you all know what happened to Nixon. Here's a hint if you don't. It's not so much the crime as it is the cover-up. Another bit of trivia about James in the 1970s. His manager and civil rights protege at that time was the Reverend Al Sharpton of MSNBC News Television and National Action Network fame. The 60s and the 70s were James's heyday, and while he still put out albums, he settled into legend status by then. He did have one more hit up his sleeve, though, as his song from the Rocky IV soundtrack, Living in America, became a top 10 smash. Rest in peace, Apollo Creed. Of course, no legend comes without baggage, and James had plenty. And it was bad. Really bad. For starters, James was a known domestic abuser. He had a sexual relationship with Motown singer Tammy Terrell starting in the early 1960s when she was 17 years old. There were allegations of beatings in many of his relationships and marriages, including one where someone said that they witnessed him kicking a pregnant girlfriend down a flight of stairs. During his third marriage, he was arrested 4 times for domestic abuse. There was also a rape allegation leveled against him in 2005 by a woman who claimed that James raped her in 1988. That case was thrown out of court due to the statute of limitations having expired at that point. James also had a history of drug abuse, along with assault with guns. During one such drug episode, he led police on a wild car chase. James was also accused of intimidation with guns, demanding sexual favors from women while wielding a gun, holding people captive, among many other things. James did spend some time in prison, but it was never for too long a time. The most was approximately 2 years. In 2003, in fact, he was pardoned in South Carolina for all the crimes that were committed in that state, of which there were quite a few, especially when he was a kid. James's health problems started to pop up in the early 2000s when he was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes and also with prostate cancer. A few days before Christmas of 2006, he ended up in the hospital with pneumonia. He figured that he would get out of the hospital in time to continue his tour schedule, as he had kept up a full performing schedule into his 70s. As he said, he had band members, road crews, and their families depending on him. In fact, James was still scheduled to perform 2 shows in New York City and New Jersey on New Year's Eve, along with a performance on CNN that night. James never got to do any of those gigs. On Christmas Day, 2006, at 1:45 a.m., he said his final words, "I'm going away tonight," took 3 long breaths, fell asleep, and passed away. James Brown passed away from congestive heart failure due to pneumonia at the age of 73. At least that's the official story. As with everything these days, there's a conspiracy, of course. In his case, a 2019 investigation by CNN and other people claimed that James was murdered. By whom? Good question. The conspiracy continues. In his lifetime, James Brown released 59 studio albums, 15 live albums, including his critically acclaimed Live at the Apollo, 49 compilation albums, 2 soundtrack albums, and 144 singles. James has been inducted into the Songwriters Hall of Fame, the Grammy Hall of Fame, the Library of Congress National Recording Registry, the Georgia Music Hall of Fame, the UK Music Hall of Fame, and the R&B Music Hall of Fame. He was nominated for 8 Grammy Awards, winning 3 of them. He's had a bridge named after him, more than a few streets, a Kennedy Center honor, and a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, among many, many, many other awards. Presented for induction by Steve Winwood of 2004 Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inductees Traffic, the Godfather of Soul, the hardest working man in showbiz, Kid Dynamite and Soul Brother #1, James Brown, inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, class of 1986. Before we get to the rest of the podcast, we'd like to tell you about our other podcast, the Music History Today podcast. Every day we tell you what happened on that date in music history, along with music releases, birthdays, and passings. So, if you like this podcast and want more music history, then please search the Music History Today podcast in audio or video form on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast from. There are many people who have yet to be inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame who have been eligible for quite some time. One of the biggest snubs from the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame committee voters is to not have producer Rick Rubin inducted into the hall. For starters, Rick co-founded the record label that brought hip-hop to the masses, Def Jam, along with Russell Simmons, who's also not nominated, but you can discuss that whole thing about Russell Simmons at a later point. Rick is so much more than just the guy who co-founded Def Jam. He is also one of the most influential producers of the last 40-some-odd years. He's been nominated for at least 21 Grammy Awards, winning 8 of them, including Album of the Year twice, once for working on the Dixie Chicks album and once for working on Adele's album. He's been nominated for Producer of the Year at the Grammys at least 5 times, winning 2 times. Here, just as an example, is a list of the artists who he has either produced or executive produced. The list goes: LL Cool J, The Beastie Boys, Run DMC, Slayer, Public Enemy, The Cult, The Less Than Zero soundtrack, Danzig, Andrew Dice Clay, The Black Crowes, The Ghetto Boys, The Red Hot Chili Peppers, Johnny Cash, Sir Mix-a-Lot, Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers, Lords of Acid, 9 Inch Nails, AC/DC, Donovan, System of a Down, Sheryl Crow, Melanie C., Rage Against the Machine, Eagle Eye Cherry, Macy Gray, Aerosmith, Audioslave, Limp Bizkit, Jay-Z, Slipknot, Lil Jon and the East Side Boys, Weezer, Shakira, the Dixie Chicks, Justin Timberlake, U2, Linkin Park, Poison, Vanessa Carlton, Neil Diamond, Jacob Dylan, Metallica, Pete Yorn, Brandy Carlisle, Typo Negative, Josh Groban, Kid Rock, Adele, ZZ Top, Lana Del Rey, Black Sabbath, Kanye West, Eminem, Lady Gaga, Ed Sheeran, the Wu-Tang Clan, James Blake, Billy Corgan, Johnny Cash, and the Smashing Pumpkins. Seriously, what more do you need to know? Rick isn't eligible as a performer, obviously, but he can get in one of the other categories. Phil Spector is in as a producer, so it's possible for Rick to get in. Therefore, just based on all of what I just said, Rick Rubin should be nominated into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in at least one of the non-performer categories. Each week in this spot, we highlight a different musical Hall of Fame or museum, since there's a bunch more than just the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. There's, for instance, the Country Music Hall of Fame, the Blues Hall of Fame, the Grammy Museum, among many others. This time, though, we're going to talk about one that isn't a hall per se. However, to me, it's probably the most important. The Library of Congress, aside from being a place in the movie All the President's Men, is the nation's library. Established in April of 1800, it has more than 38 million books, 14 million photographs, 70 million manuscripts, and 5.5 million maps. From a musical standpoint, it's important for a couple of reasons. The first is that it has over 8 million pieces of sheet music and over 3.5 million recordings. The second, and more important reason, is what it does with certain recordings. Since the passage of the National Recording Preservation Act of 2000, the library has developed a registry to preserve and protect certain pieces of music and other recordings that are considered historically relevant. That is a pretty high honor, knowing that your song or album is so important to the nation that it needs to be preserved forever. This is a pretty high-class list you're joining here. Some of these recordings are actually speeches or radio shows from yesteryear. For instance, the earliest recorded version of Abbott and Costello's Who's on First comedy sketch, Orson Welles' War of the Worlds radio broadcast, and Dr. Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech are all in the registry, as are the first recordings on cylinders that Thomas Edison used to show off the phonograph at an exhibition. The first official class was in 2002. There were 50 recordings that were declared important. All of the above-mentioned recordings were in that very first class. In 1966, the Beatles decided that they were done touring. They couldn't deal with being on stage anymore. The screaming from their fans had gotten so loud they couldn't even hear themselves play. As John Lennon said, they could, quote, send out 4 waxworks, and that would satisfy the crowds. Beatles concerts are nothing to do with music anymore. They're just bloody tribal rites, end quote. Finally, they had had enough of that. No more touring. Time to take a few months off for a break to work on individual projects. During that break, by the way, John met Yoko Ono. Then the group decided to concentrate on being in the studio and creating new music. But what and in which direction were they planning on going in? See, the band had already started to take the turn from being a glorified boy band when they put out their 1965 album Rubber Soul and then their 1966 album Revolver. Now, Paul McCartney wanted to take it to a whole other level. See, late in 1966, he had an idea about doing a song about a band. This idea then went from just a song to an entire album. Also, knowing that they never had to perform the songs live in concert ever again gave them complete freedom to produce the songs any way they wanted to. Imagine how much different Revolver or Rubber Soul would have sounded if they had stopped touring earlier and done it that way. Anyway, this album experimented with vaudeville, classical music, psychedelia, along with pop music. It also experimented with overdubbing, pitch control, automatic double tracking, and other recording tricks that today we kind of take for granted. They even took recording tape, spliced it, and flipped it upside down and in the wrong direction just to try and experiment with new sounds. What came out of all of that experimenting was pure, unadulterated genius. Remember, this was all done without the benefit of FL Studio or any other computer program for that matter. None of that had even been invented yet. The album was also the first one to have all the song lyrics included in every copy, a practice I kind of miss these days in the era of digital. On June 1st, 1967, the album Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band was released in England, and then on June 2nd in America. The album unofficially kicked off the Summer of Love and turned the Beatles into counterculture symbols. The album is considered to be one of the greatest albums of all time, both in terms of songwriting and technological use, and has certified sales of over 11 million copies in America alone and over 32 million copies sold worldwide. Legend has it that even Jimi Hendrix got a hold of the album on the morning of June 1st in England, learned the song Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band in the afternoon, and played the song that evening in concert with members of the Beatles in the audience. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band had the classic song Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, with a little help from my friends Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, Getting Better, Fixing a Hole, She's Leaving Home, Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite, Within You, Without You, When I'm 64, Lovely Rita, Good Morning, and A Day in the Life. In 1968, it won 4 Grammy Awards, including Album of the Year. It is no wonder that the Library of Congress put it into the National Recording Registry. The iconic Beatles album, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, inducted into the National Recording Registry of the Library of Congress in 2003. And that is it for this episode of the Music Halls of Fame podcast. For more podcast episodes, which drop every Thursday in audio and video form, then please like, subscribe, and click the notification bell on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio Podcasts, CastBox, Google Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcast from.